You've probably heard about them: the Maya, the Aztecs, the Incas. Maybe in school, maybe in a passing conversation. You might picture pyramids in the jungle or stone cities in the mountains. But what you've heard is only the surface. These weren't just ancient tribes frozen in time. They were full-blown empires, sophisticated and vast. They had cities with aqueducts and palaces, calendars more precise than the ones used in Europe at the time, and a spiritual worldview that shaped everything they did, from how they built to how they died. We often hear about the brilliance of Rome, the philosophy of Greece, the mystery of Egypt. But the civilizations of ancient America have been left out of that story for far too long. And that's no accident. What they achieved challenged the ideas of the so-called civilized world. The Maya didn't just study the stars, they aligned their cities with them. The Aztecs didn't just worship the sun, they believed they were keeping it alive with every ritual. And the Incas didn't write books, but they kept the entire spine of the Andes connected with roads, runners, and a system so precise it still amazes engineers today. This isn't a story about ruins. It's a story about vision, about people who saw the world differently, who understood time as sacred and the land as alive. They didn't separate religion from science or architecture from belief. Everything was part of one great rhythm. And when outsiders arrived, it wasn't their strength that brought these empires down. It was shock, betrayal, and diseases for which they had no names. They weren't defeated because they were weak. They were overwhelmed before they even knew they were at war. But they never really disappeared. Their blood flows in the veins of millions. Their languages are still whispered in markets and homes. Their symbols are tattooed into the memory of the continent itself. They adapted, they endured, and they are still here. So now you have a choice. You can keep seeing them as myths and shadows, or you can open the door to what really happened, to what they saw, to how they lived, and maybe, just maybe, to what they still have to teach us. Because the truth is this: the story of the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Incas is not over. And in the next chapter, we begin where it all truly started, deep in the jungle, under the stars, with the civilization that could read the sky like a book, the Maya. Long before the empires of the Andes and the cities on the lakes, a people emerged from the shadows of the jungle, guided not by swords or conquests, but by silence, by sky, and by rhythm. The Maya did not roar into history with the clash of empires. They whispered their truths into stone, spoke through stars, and let time itself carry their voice. In the heart of what we now call Central America, they rose, not to dominate the world but to understand it. To the Maya, the world was not made of matter alone. It was made of meaning. Every mountain was sacred. Every river carried intention. The sky was not a backdrop. It was a script written by gods, read by priests, and interpreted through cycles older than memory. Time for them was not a straight line. It was a spiral, always moving forward, always returning, always alive. They built cities like Tikal, Kapan, Calakmul, and Palenque, places that grew not outward, but upward, as if reaching toward the constellations that guided their kings. Their architecture did more than shelter. It aligned with the sun on solstices, with Venus at its brightest, with the moon during sacred eclipses. These were not simply engineers. They were mathematicians, astronomers, theologians all at once. Their entire civilization revolved around the sacred calendar, not one, but many. The Hab, a solar calendar of 365 days. The Tzolk'in, a ritual calendar of 260. And above them both, the long count, a timeline stretching back before the birth of any known city, a way to measure epochs, ages, and the turning of worlds. It was not created to mark history, but to explain it, to give every moment its proper place in the eternal order of things. Kings did not rule by force alone. They ruled by alignment. A true leader was born on a sacred day, guided by prophecy, and chosen not just by blood but by the stars. When a king ascended to the throne, he did so through ritual, through fasting, through visions. His blood was not his own, it belonged to the gods. And so he offered it willingly, drawing it with obsidian blades, letting it fall on sacred cloth that burned into smoke, a message sent skyward. But kings did not stand alone. Maya queens held real power. Lady K-Able, Lady Six Sky, these were not ceremonial figures. They ruled cities, commanded armies, led rituals. Power in the Maya world was not a rigid pyramid. It was a web of sacred responsibility, woven between men and women, gods and ancestors, the living and the dead. Their writing system, glyphs etched into stone and painted on bark, told stories with elegance and complexity unmatched in the ancient Americas. They recorded births, deaths, wars, rituals, astronomical events, and myths in an endless chain of meaning, where image and number, word and date danced together. Much of that knowledge was burned, centuries later, in fires lit by hands that feared what they could not read. But what remains still speaks. Their economy flowed not just with goods, but with symbols. Jade and obsidian, cacao and feathers, salt and honey. They traded what had value, yes, but also what had meaning. And across the lowlands and highlands, trade routes became arteries of culture, linking distant cities into a single breathing organism. Their gods were not distant deities locked in heaven. They walked in dreams. They moved in the wind. They appeared in the patterns of maize and in the thunder of storms. The most sacred stories, the ones later recorded in the Popol Vuh, spoke of a world created and destroyed more than once, of twin heroes descending into the underworld to challenge death itself, of a universe that required sacrifice not as punishment, but as renewal. Their ball courts were not games. They were theaters of cosmic drama. The ball represented the sun, the underworld, life and death in motion. Victors were honored, and sometimes the ultimate honor was to give your life in ritual sacrifice, not as loss, but as offering. And yet for all their balance, all their rhythm, cracks eventually formed. As centuries passed, cities grew hungrier for power. Alliances frayed. Wars erupted, not for survival, but for dominance, for prestige, for divine legitimacy. Some kings expanded too fast. Others ignored the sacred days. Rituals became more elaborate, more frequent, more desperate. The gods no longer answered as clearly. Or perhaps the kings no longer listened. The jungle, patient as always, began to reclaim the edges of greatness. Trade routes faltered. Crops failed. Populations shifted. In some regions, rebellion stirred. In others, drought carved famine into the bones of the people. And in the midst of it all, the sacred calendars kept turning, indifferent to human struggle. This was not one fall, but many. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling. City after city dimmed and faded, like stars in the dawn. Yet even as monumental centers emptied, the people remained. The Maya did not vanish. They transformed. They moved to new regions. They adapted their rituals. They guarded their language, their stories, their names. In the highlands, new centers rose. In the villages, old prayers were whispered into new winds. Today, the Maya are still here, more than 6 million strong, speaking over 30 distinct languages, honoring the same earth, reading the same sky, but something changed. The world they once ruled was no longer unified by the sacred calendar. The kings were gone, the temples quiet, and yet in the cornfields and in the firelight, memory endured. Because the Maya didn't build monuments for glory. They built them to last beyond the fall. They understood what we often forget, that true power is not in what we conquer, but in what we carry through darkness. And if their vision of time stirred something in you, if their temples and myths awakened a curiosity you didn't know you had, wait until you step into the city that shouldn't have existed. A city in the middle of a lake, born from prophecy, fed by conquest, fueled by fear, and ruled by an empire that believed the gods must be fed with hearts still beating. Power in the world of the Maya was never meant to be permanent. It moved like the sun, rose and fell with the cycles of time, and those who held it were expected to serve, not to possess. Kings were not merely political rulers. They were cosmic stewards, chosen not just by blood, but by signs, dreams, alignments of numbers and stars. Every coronation was a reenactment of creation. Every decision from war to harvest was part of a cosmic contract. And time, more than anything else, was the true ruler. For centuries, this balance held. Cities grew, alliances formed, rituals deepened. The calendar, that living map of destiny, gave each day its meaning. The people believed that as long as they honored the gods, followed the rhythms of the universe, and respected the sacred order, harmony would endure. But harmony is fragile, and sometimes faith turns into fear. In the late classic period, something began to shift. The great cities, once connected by trade and diplomacy, started to drift apart. Kings, desperate to preserve their legacy, pushed harder, commissioned more temples, demanded more tribute, offered more blood. Where once they had listened to the calendar, now they tried to control it. Wars that had once been sacred and ceremonial became brutal and constant. Cities like Tikal and Calakmul, once rivals in ritual grandeur, became locked in cycles of real violence. Dynasties fell. New ones rose, some in fire, others in whispers. And in the background, the priests began to warn. Prophets, oracles, and keepers of ancient knowledge began to speak of imbalance. The gods were restless. The signs were unclear. The stars were misaligned. Something was coming, something beyond the control of kings and armies. But those in power rarely listen when the truth threatens their throne. To restore order, rulers doubled down. Ceremonies became more extravagant. The temples reached higher. The sacrifices grew darker. The gods demanded offerings, and if they did not respond, it was only because the offerings had not been enough. So more blood was given, more hearts, more captives, but the silence from the heavens remained. In Kapan, a king named Uxaklajun UB adjective, a HK adjective, a WIIL, whose name means 18 rabbit, built some of the most beautiful monuments in the Maya world. He portrayed himself as divine, unshakable, chosen. But he was captured and publicly beheaded by a rival city. His death sent shockwaves through the region. If a god king could fall, what was left of the old order? And yet the people kept building. They kept believing. Even as drought gripped the land and crops failed. Even as trade routes collapsed and city walls began to crumble. They danced the old dances, lit the same fires, chanted the same names. But something had broken. Not just in the stones, but in the story. The sacred calendar, once a map of divine certainty, now marked a countdown no one could interpret. Every day still carried meaning, but that meaning no longer brought order. It brought anxiety. People feared they were reaching the end of an age, not just a political era, but a cosmic one. And perhaps they were. By the end of the 9th century, many of the major cities in the southern lowlands were abandoned. Not destroyed, not burned, simply left behind. Entire plazas still intact, were swallowed by the jungle. Temples stood empty, ball courts silent. There was no grand war, no single catastrophe, just absence. This is what archaeologists call the classic Maya collapse. But the word collapse suggests extinction, and nothing could be further from the truth. The Maya didn't vanish. They didn't fall into myth. They moved. They adapted. They became something else. In the highlands of Guatemala, the Maya built new towns. They preserved their language, their knowledge, their gods, hidden beneath layers of Christian names and European rituals, whispered in the corners of mountains and woven into the threads of their clothing. The calendar never stopped. It simply went underground. The kings may have lost their thrones. The prophets may have been silenced. But the people remembered, and that memory became survival. To this day, you can walk through the forests of Petén and find temples buried under roots, monuments carved with names no one spoke for 1,000 years, stairways leading to silence. And yet that silence speaks. It tells us that even the most powerful vision can be forgotten and remembered again, because the Maya did not lose their empire. They let it go. And if the fall of Tikal and Palenque leaves you wondering how a world built on divine time could simply fade, just wait until you meet the ones who refuse to fade at all. A people who started with nothing, no land, no allies, no legacy, only a vision, a sign from the heavens, and a promise that they would build the greatest city ever known. In the next chapter, we rise from the swamps into the stone heart of the Aztecs. They should not have survived. That's how their story begins. Outcasts, unwanted by the great powers of their time. They were called Chichamcas, barbarians, wanderers from the north who arrived too late to claim good land, too wild to be trusted, too poor to matter. Other cities mocked them, refused them entry, forced them to live in swamps and shores, on islands full of snakes and mosquitoes. And yet, this is precisely where their destiny began. Because they didn't see exile. They saw prophecy. According to legend, their god Huitzilopochtli gave them a sign. They were to build their city where they found an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake. That was where the earth would open and power would rise. And when they reached the marshy center of Lake Texcoco, they saw it. The cactus. No one else would have stopped there. But they did. And they stayed. They called it Tenochtitlan. No one could have guessed what it would become. The Aztecs, or Mexica, as they called themselves, didn't start with palaces or armies. They started with mud. With reed houses and chinampas, floating gardens they invented to grow food on water. They worked tirelessly, learned from neighbors, formed alliances, married into power. And they never forgot what it meant to be hungry. But beneath their rise was something deeper than ambition. A belief that they had been chosen, not just to rule, but to keep the universe alive. Their gods were not passive beings who granted blessings from afar. They were in constant battle. The sun, they believed, was a warrior god, forever fighting darkness. Every day he rose, wounded and weary, and every night he descended into the underworld to face death again. And if no one helped him, if the world failed to offer its own strength, he would lose. The sun would vanish, and the world would end. So the Aztecs helped him, not with songs but with sacrifice. Blood was sacred. Hearts were power. They didn't kill for cruelty. They gave because they believed the gods had already given everything for them. When Huitzilopochtli had created the sun, he had sacrificed himself. When Quetzalcoatl created humans, he had descended into death to retrieve their bones. Life came from pain, and pain, therefore, was divine. And yet, they didn't sacrifice just anyone. It was warriors captured in battle. It was part of the code. To die on the battlefield or on the altar was the greatest honor. Capturing an enemy alive was more respected than killing him. The Flower Wars, ritual battles arranged between city-states, existed not for conquest but for harvest. Of devotion, of balance, and Tenochtitlan, it grew into something no one had ever seen. A city of canals and causeways, of dazzling white temples and marketplaces that could feed hundreds of thousands. Hernán Cortés would later write, in awe and confusion, that it was more organized than any city in Spain. With aqueducts bringing clean water, with trash collected daily, with engineers who built artificial islands and flood control systems centuries ahead of their time. At its peak, it held more people than London, and all of it stood in the middle of a lake. But greatness comes with gravity. The Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, expanded rapidly, collecting tribute from hundreds of subject towns. Jade, cacao, cotton, feathers, gold. They didn't just demand goods. They demanded loyalty. Rebellion was crushed. And yet the Aztecs were not blind tyrants. They allowed local rulers to stay in power as long as they paid what was due. Their empire grew more through fear and respect than through occupation. Their social structure was clear and strict. At the top stood the emperor, the Huitzilopochtli, literally, great speaker. He was both ruler and priest, warlord and philosopher. Below him were nobles, warriors, priests, merchants, artisans, farmers, and slaves. But even slaves could earn freedom through service. Even commoners could rise through valor. Education was mandatory. Boys and girls, regardless of class, were trained from childhood. Boys learned warfare, astronomy, religion. Girls learned domestic skills and ritual knowledge. And all were taught discipline, humility, and respect for the gods. There was no separation between knowledge and spirituality. Everything they learned through ritual. Their gods were many and complex. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, creator, teacher, bringer of knowledge. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, lord of sorcery and fate. Tlaloc, god of rain and storms. Each god had faces, aspects, contradictions. They didn't offer clarity. They offered reflection. Mirrors to the world as it is, violent, beautiful, sacred, and always changing. The temples of Tenochtitlan towered over the city. At the top of the Templo Mayor stood twin shrines, one for Tlaloc, the other for Huitzilopochtli. Rain and war, life and death. Every season had its rituals. Every eclipse its danger. Every moment its weight. And yet the Aztecs did not fear death. They believed that where you died determined where your soul went. Warriors and women who died in childbirth followed the sun into glory. Others were reborn as butterflies or hummingbirds. Some went to the underworld, a place not of punishment but of transformation. Death was not an end. It was a door. But doors opened both ways, and not all who crossed into their world came with reverence. Far across the sea, ships had already left Spain, chasing gold, glory, and God. They carried steel, fire, horses, and disease. And when they arrived, they did not see a sacred empire. They saw wealth to be taken, people to be bent, gods to be broken. But that part of the story comes later. For now, remember this, the Aztecs rose from nothing. From exile, from swamp, from prophecy. And what they built was not just a city. It was a world held together by belief, sacrifice, and will. And if their city built on water defied your expectations, wait until you meet the empire that built highways through mountains, that ruled without a written language, and that connected the stars to stone across the highest skis of the Andes. If there is one part of the Aztec world that causes unease, one detail that lingers in the modern imagination like a wound, It is this: sacrifice. Not the poetic kind, not a metaphor. Real blood, real hearts, real bodies held down under obsidian blades. And yet, what if we've misunderstood it entirely? To grasp the Aztec world, you must first let go of the idea that life and death are opposites. For them, they were partners in a dance, one feeding the other, one always giving, one always taking. Life could not exist without death, and death was never meaningless. It was sacred. This belief was not born from cruelty. It was born from memory. In the Aztec creation story, the gods themselves sacrificed their lives to bring the world into being. The sun would not rise unless it was paid for. The stars would not shine unless something was given in return. They believed that the universe was constantly at risk of collapse, and that human beings had been created not to enjoy it, but to sustain it. And so, every offering was a reenactment of that first divine gift. A tribute not of violence, but of gratitude. The heart was not just an organ. It was the seat of courage, spirit, heat. To offer it was to release energy, to feed the sun in its endless battle against darkness. And if the gods had given their hearts first, how could humans refuse? But the rituals were more than physical. They were theater. Choreographed, public, filled with symbolism. Priests, dressed as gods, moved through the temple steps with slow precision. Drums echoed through the plaza. Incense filled the air. Flowers scattered. And then in the peak of silence, the blade. The offering. These ceremonies were not constant, nor arbitrary. They followed the calendar, marked by the position of the stars, by seasons and omens. Some were small, private. Others filled the Templo Mayor, with thousands watching, weeping, chanting. Each ritual had its meaning. Some to bring rain, some to stop famine, some to honor the new fire, the renewal of time itself. Captives were often the chosen ones, not at random but with purpose. They were warriors taken in battle, often treated with reverence in the days before their death. Given food, rest, honored as part of the sacred exchange. In some cases, they even impersonated gods for months, living as divine avatars before returning to the earth in sacrifice. And not all sacrifice was fatal. Bloodletting was common among nobles and priests. They would pierce their tongues, ears, or genitals, letting drops fall onto paper or into sacred bowls. The pain was part of the offering, a way to feel the passage between realms, a way to communicate. They believed that blood spoke when words could not. To the Aztecs, the greatest shame was not death. It was to die without meaning. A man who died in war, a woman who died in childbirth, a youth who was chosen as a divine representative, these were not tragedies. These were honors, paths to paradise. Their souls would accompany the sun across the sky, then return to earth as birds or butterflies, dancing over flowers and fields. We must understand this. The Aztecs did not fear death. They feared imbalance. They feared what would happen if the rituals failed, if the sun were left hungry, if the rain stopped, if the gods turned their backs. Theirs was a universe held together by a fragile agreement, and every citizen, every ritual, every drop of blood was part of that agreement. But the cost of belief is often weight. And the more the empire grew, the more it demanded. Conquered cities were required to send tribute, not just in goods, but in people. The Flower Wars, originally meant to train warriors and provide symbolic captives, became more frequent, more intense. In time, some began to wonder, had the rituals grown beyond their purpose? Were the gods still listening? Or had the empire begun to worship its own fear? These questions did not come from enemies. They came from within. Poets in Texcoco wrote verses that questioned the nature of life and illusion. Priests debated omens, the great droughts of the late 15th century, the comets that streaked the sky. Some saw them as warnings, others as signs of an even greater offering needed. Still, the empire pressed on. Temples grew taller. Rituals grew more elaborate. Festivals lasted for weeks. The heart of Tenochtitlan beat with fire, song, and sacrifice. And from the outside, the empire looked unstoppable, but something ancient was shifting. The gods had never asked for silence. They asked for balance. And perhaps somewhere along the way, that balance tipped. Not because of cruelty, but because fear had taken root in the soil of devotion. And into this world, charged with glory and tension, faith and fire, would soon arrive men from the other side of the sea. Men who would not see sacred order, only savagery. Men who would not understand the blood, only the blade. And in their ignorance, they would tear through the temples, burn the codices, and bring with them a violence more lasting than any knife. But that is still to come. For now, we must not look away. We must see the Aztecs not through the lens of horror, but through the lens of devotion. They believed they were holding the universe together. And for a time they did, because sometimes what seems brutal to us was once an act of love. A dark, trembling love offered to the sky. And if this world of sacred blood has shaken your understanding of belief, wait until you climb into the mountains, where an empire without gold, without writing, without horses, ruled the spine of a continent with nothing but thread, stone, and silence. They didn't write books. They didn't leave scrolls or alphabets carved in stone. They left roads. Thousands of kilometers of stone-paved roads, stretching across mountains and deserts, connecting the cold of the Andes with the green of the jungle and the silence of the coast. They left terraces cut into cliffs, aqueducts guiding water like veins, and temples aligned so perfectly with the solstices that light itself became a language. They were the Incas, and what they built was not just an empire. It was a body, a living body whose heartbeat was the sun. Unlike the Maya or the Aztecs, the Incas rose quickly. In just over a century, they expanded from a single valley in what is now southern Peru to control the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. They called their land Tawantinsuyu, the four regions united, and from their capital in Cusco, they ruled with a clarity of purpose and precision that left even their enemies in awe. But to understand their rise, we must begin not with their armies but with their belief. For the Incas, the world was built on duality and harmony. Everything had its counterpart, sun and moon, male and female, above and below, past and future. They believed that the gods lived within the world, not beyond it. The mountains were spirits. The rivers were mothers. The stones had memory. And at the center of all life stood Inti, the sun. The Sapa Inca, the emperor, was not just a man. He was the son of Inti. His body was sacred. His breath carried authority. His words were law. And when he died, he did not simply pass. He transformed. His body remained mummified, dressed in gold, seated in palaces, consulted for generations. His lineage would continue, but he would still rule in death, fed by priests, honored by parades. For the Incas, death did not remove a king from power. It multiplied his presence. But how did such a vast empire function without writing, with memory? The Incas used Quipus, bundles of knotted strings made from wool or cotton, dyed in different colors and arranged in a complex system of knots. Each knot held a number. Each pattern told a story. Quipucamiocs, the keepers of the knots, were trained from childhood to read them. They recorded census data, harvests, tribute, battles, genealogies. The quipu was not a script. It was a structure, a neural network made of thread. And the network didn't end there. The Inca Empire was connected by the Quipus, the royal road. Over 40,000 kilometers of pathways, footbridges, staircases, tunnels, crossing mountains and rivers, deserts and canyons. Messengers called chasquis ran along these roads, passing messages encoded in Quipus and carried in memory. They could transmit news across vast distances in a matter of days. There were no wheels, just legs, lungs, and devotion. Each town was part of a greater system. Fields were cultivated in islas, community units that shared labor and resources. Instead of currency, they used reciprocity. Instead of markets, they used tribute and redistribution. Warehouses, called calcas, stored food and supplies for use in times of famine or war. In times of drought, no one starved. In times of conflict, the empire fed its armies from reserves stored years in advance. It wasn't socialism. It wasn't capitalism. It was something else entirely, a sacred economy based on obligation, memory, and time. And the time was marked not with pages, but with shadows. The Incas built Intihuatana stones, hitching posts of the sun, which captured the moment of solstice with exact precision. At Machu Picchu, the sun aligns perfectly with the sacred window on June 21st. It wasn't just astronomy. It was a declaration. We know where we stand in the universe. We belong to this rhythm. Their architecture reflected the same truth. Walls of perfectly fitted stones, without mortar, able to withstand earthquakes for centuries. Temples layered with meaning, built on older foundations, aligned with celestial bodies, filled with offerings of gold and silver. They didn't decorate for beauty. They shaped space to channel energy. Cusco itself was designed in the shape of a puma, with its head at the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, its heart in the central plaza, and its tail in the confluence of rivers. And then there was gold. To the Incas, gold was not wealth. It was the sweat of the sun. Silver, the tears of the moon. These metals were not meant to be hoarded, but transformed into masks, jewelry, sacred vessels, offerings to temples and mummies. The Coricancha, the temple of the sun in Cusco, was once covered in gold. Statues of llamas, corn stalks, birds, life recreated in shimmering light. Not to flaunt riches, but to reflect the power of the sun back into the world. But the empire was not without challenge. As it grew, so did the need for control. Conquered regions were integrated quickly. Children of local rulers were brought to Cusco to be educated and influenced. Roads were built to move troops, but also to move culture. The Inca imposed their language, Quechua, as the official tongue. They allowed local gods to remain, but placed Inti above them all. Resistance was met with diplomacy when possible, with war when necessary. The Inca army was vast, disciplined, and devastating. Warriors trained in formations, equipped with slings, spears, clubs, and armor made of hardened cloth. They didn't fight for loot. They fought for order. And most of the time, order prevailed. But beneath that order, tension grew. Succession was never simple. When a Sapa Inca died, his lands and wealth remained with his mummy cult. The new ruler had to build everything from scratch, new palaces, new estates, new glory. And so, expansion became necessity. Each ruler had to outdo the last. Each campaign was a legacy project. And when Huayna Capac died suddenly, likely from disease, without naming a clear successor, everything began to fracture. Civil war broke out between his sons, Atahualpa in the north, Huascar in the south. Brothers turned against each other. Armies marched across lands once united. And just as the war reached its peak, strangers arrived on the coast. Strangers with animals no one had seen. with weapons that cracked like thunder, with armor that reflected the sun, but hearts cold with ambition. But that story still waits. For now, remember what the Incas built. They united mountains. They moved rivers. They turned silence into structure. And they did it not for wealth, but for balance. Not to conquer, but to connect. And if an empire built with thread and stone could rise so high without ever writing a word, wait until you see how it endured, even after the arrival of death cloaked in steel and fire. From a distance, the Inca Empire looked like pure order. Roads that stretched like veins across mountains, terraces carved into impossible slopes, warehouses so well stocked they could feed armies for years. Everything in its place. Everyone with a role. A machine built of stone and memory. But beneath that order pulsed something far more powerful than fear or force. The Incas ruled with faith, faith in the code that bound them all together, the invisible thread of reciprocity, reverence, and sacred rhythm. To understand this code, you must forget the systems you know. The Incas had no currency, no written language, no courts in the Western sense. Yet their empire functioned with astonishing efficiency. How? Through a network of expectations so deeply embedded in daily life that it became instinct. The people gave what they could. The state returned what was needed. And all of it flowed through a principle older than empire, Aini. Aini means today for you, tomorrow for me. It was not a transaction. It was a way of being. Communities worked the fields of a neighbor, knowing their own fields would be worked in return. Labor was not sold, it was shared. This principle extended all the way to the top. The empire demanded service, mida, a rotational labor tax. Men built roads, terraces, temples, bridges. Women wove cloth, tended herds, prepared rituals. But in return, they received land, food, shelter, and protection. The state gave back, and so the code remained intact. And yet, the center of it all was not power. It was belief. The Incas believed the world was alive, that every mountain had a name, that every river had a spirit. These sacred places were called huacas, and they were honored constantly, with offerings of chicha, feathers, coca leaves, even songs. Some were natural, springs, caves, stones. Others were man-made, temples, altars, mummies. Each region had its own huacas, woven into the spiritual geography of the land. And the emperor, he was the axis of that spiritual map. The Sapa Inca was more than a ruler. He was a living link between the sky and the earth. His body carried the sun's authority. His voice carried weight beyond words. He performed rituals not just as a priest, but as a cosmic fulcrum. When he stood before Inti, the sun god, he was not praying. He was conversing. Even in death, that connection remained. The Incas mummified their rulers with painstaking care. They were dressed, fed, visited, paraded. Decisions were made in consultation with them. Their lands, servants, and priests remained active. In many ways, the dead ruled alongside the living. Power was never transferred. It was extended. The past was not behind them, it stood beside them. And guiding it all was the thread. The quipu. To the outsider it looked like nothing, strings and knots, tangled and silent. But to the trained eyes of the Quipu, it was a map of memory. Each color represented a category: gold, corn, warriors, births, deaths. Each knot held numbers. Each position held meaning. They were census, calendar, account book, and archive all in one. But there may have been more. Some scholars now believe certain Quipus held narrative information, stories encoded in patterns we have not yet learned to read. Quipus were more than record. They were responsibility. A curaca, or local leader, had to report what his village produced, how many people lived there, what they owed the state. The Quipus ensured nothing was forgotten. And forgetting was dangerous, not just for the empire, but for the balance it protected. The Inca system functioned like a nervous system, fast, reactive, structured, but it also had a soul. At every stage, rituals marked time. The sun was honored at Inti Raymi, the great festival of light. The dead were remembered in sacred processions. The planting and harvest were accompanied by music and prayer. Labor and faith were not separate acts. They were threads in the same cloth. And cloth was sacred. The Incas considered finely woven textiles more valuable than gold. They were worn in ceremony, offered to the gods, exchanged to seal treaties. The act of weaving itself was spiritual, repeating patterns inherited from ancestors, guided by numbers, dreams, and silence. In the hands of a skilled weaver, the past became visible. A vision made fabric. Control, then, was not enforced with terror. It was upheld with ritual, memory, and mutual need. The people followed the system not because they feared punishment, but because they trusted it. The roads, the granaries, the terraces, they weren't just infrastructure. They were expressions of cosmic order. And the closer one lived to that order, the more life made sense. But order can carry its own weight. The more efficient the empire became, the more delicate its balance. When one part failed, all others trembled. And beneath the surface of unity, ambition stirred. Every new emperor had to build a new legacy. Old estates could not be reused. Old temples could not be inherited. Expansion became necessity. Glory became pressure. And when Huayna Capac died without a clear heir, the fabric began to fray. His sons, Atahualpa and Huascar, plunged the empire into civil war. Brother against brother, army against army. The road system that once brought order now carried soldiers. Quipus that once recorded tribute now recorded blood. And while they fought, strange ships touched the western coast. Men arrived speaking another tongue, wearing iron and fear. They came not with tribute, but with fire. And they found an empire distracted, divided, wounded from within, but the thread had not broken. Not yet, because even as the Spaniards marched inland, the Incas still believed in their code, still trusted their rituals, still turned to their ancestors. They could not imagine that what was coming would not negotiate, would not honor Aini, would not recognize the sun. They expected invasion. What they received was erasure. And still, even as the world they knew began to collapse, they left behind more than ruins. They left behind a rhythm, a silence that endures, a resistance woven into memory. And in the next chapter, we witness how all three empires met the end, not with surrender, but with fire, prophecy, betrayal, and voices that refused to be silenced. No empire imagines its end. The Maya believed in cycles, not collapse. The Aztecs trusted the rituals that had held up the sun for generations. The Incas walked the mountains with the confidence of those who thought the world had already been ordered. And yet, in less than a single century, the great empires of ancient America would be struck down, not by prophecy, not by drought, not by their gods, but by something far more terrifying: strangers. Strangers who did not understand their languages, their rituals, their gods. Strangers who mistook order for weakness, sacrifice for savagery, gold for currency. Strangers who came not to learn, but to take. They brought horses, cannons, and iron, but the deadliest weapon they carried was invisible. Disease crossed the ocean before they even arrived. Smallpox spread through the Americas like fire through dry forest, weakening kings, emptying cities, unraveling systems built over centuries. In the Andes, Huayna Capac died of this new sickness, along with his heir. The civil war that followed between Atahualpa and Huáscar tore the Inca world in half. Cusco became a fractured capital. And just as the fighting reached its peak, Francisco Pizarro landed on the coast. He brought fewer than 200 men. But he arrived to an empire exhausted, unsure of itself, unsure of its gods. Atahualpa had just defeated his brother when Pizarro requested a meeting. The Sapa Inca, clothed in gold, carried on a litter by his nobles, agreed to speak. He brought no weapons, only the certainty that no man would dare defy the child of the sun. But the Spanish were not bound by that belief. They struck. In a single hour, they killed thousands of his guards and captured the emperor himself. The gods did not intervene. Or perhaps they did. But in silence, Atahualpa offered a ransom, more gold than the Spanish had ever seen. Room after room filled with treasure, enough to melt into legends. But when the ransom was paid, they killed him anyway. They strangled the son of the sun with a garrote. And as his body fell, so did the last breath of imperial unity. In Tenochtitlan, the end came in blood. Cortés arrived in the valley with allies, native enemies of the Mexica who saw a chance for revenge. He was welcomed at first. Moctezuma, the emperor, allowed him entry into the capital, unsure of whether the prophecy had come true, that one day the god Quetzalcoatl would return from the east. But when the Spaniards took him prisoner, and when their soldiers massacred worshippers during a festival, the city erupted. Stones rained from rooftops. Warriors painted in eagle feathers and obsidian masks stormed the causeways. The Spanish fled under cover of night in what would be remembered as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Many drowned in the lake, pulled down by the very gold they tried to carry. But Tenochtitlan could not hold forever. Disease weakened the city from within. Siege and starvation followed. When the Spanish returned, they found less resistance. And so the great city of the lake, the jewel of the Mexica, was burned, flooded, and buried under the ruins of its own temples. Where the Templo Mayor had stood, they would build a cathedral. Where the heart of the empire had once pulsed with music, they poured cement. And yet it did not feel like victory. Even the Spaniards, in their letters and chronicles, spoke of awe, of cities more beautiful than anything they had known, of palaces, markets, ordered gardens, songs, temples, laws. They knew what they were destroying, and they destroyed it anyway. The Maya faced a different end. By the time the Spanish arrived in the Yucatan, the great cities had already been abandoned. The Maya had fractured into smaller kingdoms, but they had not forgotten who they were. They fought with fierce resistance. They retreated into forests, reorganized, disappeared into the land they knew better than any outsider. Their cities were hard to find, their spirit harder to kill. The conquest of the Maya took not years, but centuries. And even then, it never truly finished. Rebellions rose throughout the colonial period. Languages endured. Ceremonies were hidden in Catholic names. Stories were whispered through generations. While the temples crumbled, memory held firm. The Maya did not fall. They faded from the enemy's eyes and survived in the spaces between. And so the empires burned, not in explosions but in silence. The silence of books burned in squares. The silence of names erased. The silence of drums that no longer beat. Gods did not fall because they lost. They fell because their people were forced to worship in secret. But even in that silence, something remained. A road that cuts through mountains. A pyramid that still marks the solstice. A chant sung in a language older than empire. A face, a song, a word, a prayer. Alive. And if the fall of these empires felt like an ending, then you haven't listened closely enough. Because what they built was never meant to disappear. It was meant to return. And in the final chapter, we walk among what remains, not in ruins but in people, not in stories but in blood. And we ask, what truly survives when gods fall? They said they were gone, that the temples had crumbled, the gods had fallen, the cities swallowed by jungle and ash, that the stories had faded, the languages broken, the empires turned to dust. But they were wrong, because if you listen, truly listen, you will hear them. In the voice of an elder speaking Nahuatl in a village north of Mexico City. In the weaver's hands in the highlands of Guatemala, who still knots thread in the shape of the cosmos. In the farmer who plants according to the moon, who still whispers thanks to the mountain before he harvests. The fire never died. It was carried. The Maya still walk the land. In Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, Chiapas, the Yucatan, millions still speak the tongues of their ancestors. They celebrate the Hab, the Tzolk'in, the solstices and eclipses. They remember not just who they are, but how to live with the world, not above it. And every time they chant, every time they plan, every time they dream, the empire returns, quiet, patient, alive. In the shadow of what was once Tenochtitlan, now called Mexico City, the descendants of the Mexica rise again. Not with armies, but with memory. With dances, prayers, songs that refuse to be forgotten. The feathered serpent flies again in murals. The names return in ceremonies held at the ruins of temples, where schoolchildren stand barefoot and ask the sun to listen. They survived conquest. They survived denial. And now they reclaim what was never truly lost. High in the Andes, the Inca bloodline still pulses. In Cusco, in Puno, in the villages where the clouds touch the earth, Quechua is not a relic, it's a language of lullabies and laws. The terraces are still green. The Ilu still organizes the planting. The thread still carries meaning. And at Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, the Sapa Inca is reborn each year, dressed in gold, speaking to a god that never stopped listening. These civilizations were not broken. They were buried. And now they rise. Not just in ruins and museums, but in voices, bodies, choices. In resistance and pride. In the right to speak an old name. In the power of remembering. Because that's how memory works. You can burn a book, but not a song. You can ban a language, but not a heartbeat. You can tear down a temple, but not the rhythm it was built to follow. The empires are not gone. They became people. People who walk today with the weight and the wonder of millennia in their blood. People who are not ruins, but continuities. Not victims of history, but survivors who carry the sacred forward. What the world once called mythology, they call truth. What others see as past, they live as present. And so, my friend, if this story moved you, it's because part of you remembers. Remembers a world where time was sacred. Where the sun needed your help to rise. Where a city could float on water. Where roads could be sewn across the sky. Where stone could sing. Where gods could speak through thunder and corn and stars. If you made it this far, it means the fire burns in you too. Let it burn. Let it guide you to ask deeper questions. To walk with reverence. To see what remains hidden beneath your feet. To listen when the wind sounds like prayer. Because the Maya, the Mexica, and the Inca were never meant to be forgotten. They were meant to be remembered. And now you carry their names. And if you want more stories like this, truths buried under silence, wisdom masked as myth, subscribe to this channel and become part of the journey. Because this was not the end. This was only the beginning. The gods did not fall. They changed form, and now they speak again.